Something's off in Lake Lapcat, and it's not just because a gigantic Bowser is wreaking havoc. Bowser's Fury, released for the Nintendo Switch in 2021, is an experimental 3D Mario experience, tacked on to their re-release of 2013's Super Mario 3D World. Right from the beginning, the game makes the deliberate choice of an oh-so-familiar camera angle, that of Super Mario Sunshine, followed by the iconic Goop M. The similarities between Bowser's Fury and Sunshine are readily apparent. Both take place on islands, both contain mysterious goop, both task the player with finding shines hidden across the world, and both place a focus on Bowser Jr. While they both share superficial similarities, it's the consistency between Super Mario Sunshine's aesthetics and gameplay that Bowser's Fury lacks. Super Mario Sunshine has gameplay fitting of its tropical setting. Cleaning up a dirty environment that should be pristine is both logical and inherently satisfying. The player is surrounded by water, and it's not just background scenery. The player can utilize it to fight enemies, traverse the environment, and, of course, clean up goop. In contrast, Bowser's Fury lacks a genuine tie between its aesthetics and gameplay. You are surrounded by cat-themed enemies and imagery, but the location makes absolutely no sense logically. Just look at how my cat reacts to even being near water, and there's no way he would go out in the rain. It seems like theming based on the catsuit was conceptualized, and the developers had to compromise on the world on account of technical limitations. The idea of something focused on cats being combined with pretty much their natural enemy makes me wonder if the water and islands based approach was a concession they had to make in order to facilitate the open world. I ultimately can't help but think the overall setting and aesthetic was a failure. In the case that technical difficulties did lead to this setting, if your hardware isn't up to snuff in order to make a truly open world project, it's better to wait and save the idea for when it's ready, rather than make concessions and changes to account for hardware failings. I don't want to be an ideas guy, but when you think of cats and platforming, what comes to mind? It's definitely not islands and water, it's a cat tree. Something like this would logically tie the cat theming and setting in with the platforming gameplay. Of course, I'm not trying to tell the developers what settings they should pursue, it's just something like this would much more cohesively tie the visuals and gameplay together. While the visuals and setting of Bowser's Fury ultimately feel lacking, it's the platforming challenges that fare slightly better. The developers took on the difficult task of trying to tie 3D Mario's two distinct styles of gameplay together, that being the open-world collecting-based games and the flagpole ones. Mario's first time running through one of the game's mini islands might see them collect some power-ups, accumulate 5 tokens, identify where the unbreakable Fury blocks are, and ultimately collect the first shine. At Bowser's Fury's best, it feels like a short level in Super Mario 3D World, albeit surrounded with water and some more goals and side objectives. However, the level design feels lacking due to the constant reuse of ideas from the base game of 3D World. In the background is a compilation of various reused ideas from the main game to prove my point. If it feels like Bowser's Fury is often retreading familiar territory, it's because it is, and usually from 3D World. I understand Super Mario 3D World reuses and builds upon many ideas from the Super Mario series' storied past, which I don't believe is a problem. Where I believe a problem arises is when you begin to recycle level design from the other game on the cartridge. I'd actually go so far as to say that Bowser's Fury has more recycled level design ideas than new ones, but I haven't actually done the math or anything, so I'll let my compilation speak for itself. Additionally, many of these islands lack the refined sandbox level design approach usual 3D Mario games have, and it feels incredibly linear and samey as a result. The thing most representative of this would be the Propeller Blocks. At first I wanted to praise these blocks. It's a quick way for the player to traverse a level they've already completed, but after considering older Mario games I had a change of heart. Nobody would want to use a Propeller Block in Super Mario 64's Tick-Tock Clock. Even though you have to enter Tick-Tock Clock more times than your average Bowser's Fury level, the simple act of controlling Mario is fun and engaging, yet challenging platforming keeps the level entertaining, even on repeat playthroughs. I don't believe the same can be said for the average Bowser's Fury level. The Propeller Block ultimately feels like a crutch from the developers in order to account for their less than stellar level design. The thing most similar to these blocks would be the cannons. While they both serve as shortcuts for the player, actually activating the cannon is a challenge in itself, unlike the automatically appearing propeller blocks. In addition, the cannons are locked to certain angles, and the act of firing Mario tests the player's ability to account for distance and Mario's trajectory. On the other hand, propeller blocks are far more versatile, and instead allow the player to skip vast sections of platforming without any genuine challenge. If the developers could not make the simple act of traversing their levels multiple times interesting, rather than relying on the propeller block, they should have probably gone back to the drawing board entirely. It's unfortunate because the developers actually took the time to program new enemy layouts and such for every time you re-enter a level. While this is a great idea, it ends up feeling underused. As mentioned earlier, your first run through an island might see you collect up to 3 different shines. With each island only containing 5 shines, this essentially means you'll find yourself over halfway finished with a level after just one run through. In order to access later shines, the game requires the player to leave the area and come back, or return to the title screen. While this might seem to encourage players to visit other levels and collect things out of order, it ends up being a downgrade compared to previous 3D Mario games. The level selects, accessible via the hub worlds in the previous games, accommodated 2 types of players: those who preferred to tackle every level back to back, and those who prefer to split their time up between different courses. As a player that prefers the former, I found myself incredibly disappointed with the approach found in Bowser's Fury. The absolute worst offender for this has to be Claw Swipe Coliseum. Home to 3 different boss battles, the game requires the player to, for every single boss fight, tediously leave the area and return, or quit to the title screen. This means climbing the relatively same terrain 3 times and completing the exact same task, a boss fight, again and again. A task that is repeated exactly from Super Mario 3D World, which is also repeated exactly from Super Mario 3D Land. Going to the title screen and reloading the game simply to access the next shine feels like something I would absolutely never find myself doing in a Nintendo game. Bowser's Fury encourages players to tackle levels out of order, something the previous games did just fine while simultaneously accommodating players like myself. This is a concession that allows every single level to be in one large open world instance. But the shortcomings as a result of this far outweigh the positives. Due to this single world, the game features smaller stages, a flawed level select, tedious treks between areas, a compromised visual aesthetic, and poor performance. While you're tackling these levels, it's only a matter of time before Bowser's Fury really begins. With the appearance of Bowser comes a variety of changes across the map, the most obvious being that of the weather, perfectly setting the tone for an encounter with Gay Bowser. Additionally, a variety of new blocks and platforming areas appear for Mario to utilize throughout the levels. And, most importantly, Bowser begins to rain lava from above and shoot fire at the player. All of this ends up creating a degree of spectacle that a Mario game really hasn't seen before. It feels like almost every single moment with Bowser is screenshot worthy, and the rain in combination with the music sets a perfect mood for avoiding or fighting this behemoth of a boss. Whether you're narrowly avoiding his fire by hiding behind a block, or making the perfect jump to avoid getting hit, it really does create an excellent job of keeping you on the edge of your seat. I would go so far as to say Bowser's Fury is worth picking up to experience this just once. However, and most importantly, how does it alter the gameplay? On paper, Bowser's Waking Up offers risks and rewards for the player, the risk being Bowser's wide variety of attacks, and the reward being new, albeit destructible, risky shortcut paths for Mario to take on the different levels. The issue, however, lies with the inclusion of these Fury bricks, which can only be destroyed by his fiery breath. Inside these bricks lies a shine, essentially the most valuable reward in the game. Thanks to a generous bit of time before Bowser actually appears, signaled by rain, the player can minimize any sort of risk by getting into the perfect position before Bowser even appears. The damage this causes to these segments is almost as large as the boss himself. It encourages the player to, at the sight of rain, drop whatever task they're doing and immediately run to the nearest Fury blocks, all of which lack any sort of meaningful platforming challenge. It completely destroys the risk-reward system I mentioned earlier, by giving the player the most valuable collectible in the game with largely no danger. And thanks to Bowser disappearing after a shine is collected for the vast majority of playtime, completely trivializes what should be a highlight of the entire game. A solution to this issue could be a platforming challenge to reach them, only available during the storm. Just this one adjustment to the placement of Fury blocks could have easily solved many of my previously listed problems with the system. Eventually, you'll find yourself trying to survive Bowser without any shines lying in bricks to collect, or the ability to immediately send him packing. This is where the mode really should shine, and it generally does. However, when the game removes the ability to immediately take Bowser out, it comes far, far too late. Likely after the player has already subconsciously removed Fury Bowser as a threat, after repeatedly trivializing his segment. That being said, taking shortcuts and trying to complete your goal, all under fire from Bowser, make for gameplay we've truly never seen before in a Mario game. There's just one shortcoming, however, that of the framerate. It's incredibly disappointing moving from 3D World's impeccable framerate to Bowser's Fury's lacking one. The technical issues always come when you're fighting Bowser, which is to say when you're doing precise, important platforming under stress, aka the absolute most important time the game should never be losing frames. This ultimately makes the platforming during Bowser's onslaught frustrating and generally unsatisfying. I have to come back to my previous point. If the tech isn't ready for this sort of thing, it's better to wait than release an unsatisfactory, compromised product. And that's what Bowser's Fury ends up feeling like. Compromises for technology also extend to the handheld mode of the game. While the large-scale battles and environments seem suited for TV play, it's likely many people gave the game a shot non-docked, due to reasons such as the Switch Lite. The performance during handheld mode is, quite frankly, unacceptable. It's baffling Nintendo would release something this shoddy performance-wise, and it ends up making Bowser's Fury feel like a strange experiment that just wasn't quite ready for public release, but was done so anyways. Another compromise made for technology appears to be that of Plessy. Due to the various islands of Lake Lapcat being spread about, likely to account for loading, Mario must use Plessy to get from place to place. The game also asks the player to utilize Plessy for a variety of different shines, such as time attacks and platforming. Fundamentally, Plessy is similar to the slides found in Super Mario 64, something we could see in Super Mario 3D World when they share the same music. The problem is the amount of time the game makes you utilize Plessy for not only transportation, but shine gathering. Accounting for nearly 15% of all shines in Bowser's Fury, Plessy ends up overstaying its welcome by a long shot. Although fun at first, it ends up getting tiring by the end of the game's runtime. As entertaining as Super Mario 64's various slide levels were, they only account for 7 or 8 stars in that game. Now imagine if the amount of slide levels were doubled, and you have Bowser's Fury, and that doesn't even account for the time spent on Plessy moving around. Compared to the various options Mario has available to him, the blandness of Plessy is immediately apparent. The developers of Bowser's Fury were aware that 3D World's bare-bones Plessy wasn't enough to justify the amount of time spent on him. So believe it or not, he's actually upgraded compared to his 3D World appearance. You can move around, jump, dive, but that's it. The only other interesting aspect of Bowser's Fury's Plessy is timing your jumps following dives to earn a bit of speed. Pressing the jump button for a boost of speed at just the right time after a dive to glorious fanfare and a lively animation truly is satisfying. But it isn't enough to make gameplay featuring Plessy interesting. Plessy and his frankly boring moveset get in the way of simply playing as Mario far, far too much. At least with Super Mario 64's slide levels, you were still controlling Mario just as you would for the rest of the game, which is the complete opposite of Bowser's Fury. If Plessy were a 1 or 2 time thing like 3D World, I wouldn't be complaining. But the amount of time in-game spent on Plessy is much too excessive. Equally unsatisfying is Mario's moveset in Bowser's Fury. Gone are many of 3D Mario's most iconic moves, such as the triple jump. A majority of Mario's vertical movement options also feel nerfed compared to previous installments. It may be an unfortunate remnant of Super Mario 3D World, but playing a 3D Mario game without a triple jump just feels unnatural, and it leaves Mario's moveset feeling slightly unsatisfactory as a result. A good example of why the triple jump would make for an excellent addition would be this wall at the start of the game. With the inclusion of the triple jump, a skilled player could time and space their jumps to smoothly scale this wall without stopping. In Bowser's Fury, however, you'll have to stop moving, spin for a moment, or ground pound jump and then spring into the air. Both are fun moves, don't get me wrong, but they don't allow Mario to keep his horizontal momentum, and having to constantly perform moves like this grinds the platforming to an unsatisfying halt. Of course, this is in order to incentivize using the catsuit. With this power-up equipped, the player can effortlessly scale walls like this, and even much higher ones without any trouble at all. Of Mario's moveset, the thing that seems to harm the gameplay the most has to be the run button. Due to the inclusion of holding Y to run, a holdover from 3D World, trying to navigate the world quickly while adjusting the camera is nigh impossible. Running in Super Mario 3D World was an incredibly simple task, and should the player ever need to swap camera angles, they could accomplish it via a quick flick of the stick, rather than constantly having to baby it like Bowser's Fury asks the player to. The issues with running are actually a symptom of a much greater issue in the game, the camera in its entirety. When comparing the camera between Bowser's Fury and the main game, the difference between the two is immediately apparent. The main game utilizes fixed camera angles and allows the player to make small adjustments via the stick. This is in complete contrast to the player-controlled camera found in Bowser's Fury. Even comparing Bowser's Fury and Super Mario Sunshine, we can see how lacking the camera in Bowser's Fury feels. The camera is ultimately cramped and claustrophobic. It's often difficult to get a full gauge of the area, leading to the player constantly babying the camera in order to keep everything in picture. I can't help but think how much of a step down this is in comparison to the main game's near-perfect camera system. The benefits of a fixed camera a la 3D World in a Mario game are immediately recognizable. A fixed camera allows the developers to select the best camera angle for the action, something we can easily see by comparing 3D World's moving platform section and the one found in Bowser's Fury. It also allows the player to more consistently understand their relative position in a 3D space. By constantly having to move the camera around, or perhaps accidentally putting it into an awkward angle, it's easy to lose your place in the game world. And most importantly, having a fixed camera allows the player to keep their right hand on the face buttons. It goes without saying, but jumping is incredibly important in a Mario game. Something Bowser's Fury throws a wrench into. You often have to make the decision between controlling the camera and jumping. Even more frustrating is the act of controlling the camera, jumping, and moving quickly. I can only imagine how difficult Bowser's Fury must be for speedrunners. Perhaps this zoomed-in camera was another victim of hardware limitations. It's impossible to say for sure, but in the end I feel like Bowser's Fury ends up having the worst camera in a three-dimensional Mario game. Alongside changes to the camera system, Bowser's Fury also makes changes to how power-ups function. Expanding upon 3D World's single-item storage, Bowser's Fury allows the player to keep up to 5 of every single item on them at once. Players can traverse the world, collect power-ups, and transform into them at will. This is a great idea, especially for an open-world game, but it ultimately feels like missed potential. The developers failed to utilize this system in any new or unique ways. For example, you never need to bring a power-up from one location to another to get a star. You never need to combine 2 power-ups together to collect something, such as climbing a tower with a catsuit and tossing a boomerang to collect something. You almost never meaningfully use power-ups in new and interesting ways. In fact, what feels like 90% of the time, the catsuit is the best option. This is admittedly in line with the game's theming, but it comes with the effect of making the other power-ups feel incredibly pointless. Outside of one instance with invisible platforms, the fire flower is almost never needed. The same goes for the boomerang and Tanuki suit. It's a shame because 3D World shows us just how much power-ups can be creatively used. To continue with the fire flower example, throughout 3D World we light up dark areas, defeat foes, send fireballs barreling through new clear pipes, stun pesky enemies, and more. Comparatively, in Bowser's Fury, we simply unveil hidden platforms and defeat enemies. Bowser's Fury doesn't try anything new or unique with any of its power-ups, with the Fire Flower's hidden platforms being the sole standout. This essentially makes the entire system feel like wasted potential. The only remaining use for the power-up system is that of additional health for Mario. Those playing poorly can repeatedly power up with little consequence, or use them to tank damage in bad situations. The one delivering these power-ups to Mario is Bowser Jr., and I'd be remiss not to at least mention him given his presence throughout the game and in marketing. He's available in the game as an AI companion or as a second player. Ultimately, his presence in my game was quite minor. This is due in part to a handy slider Nintendo has provided for us in the options menu. This is the sort of progress I'm happy to see Nintendo making. Oftentimes, their games lack comprehensive option menus, and Bowser's Fury is a step in the right direction, albeit a small one. Players can choose between Bowser Jr. helping all the time, or not at all, and everything in between. Bowser Jr. can assist in general gameplay, and you can direct him to paint over certain areas in the game world, generally granting you a power-up. Bowser Jr. can toss you the power-ups you've collected as well. While this gives an in-game justification for the power-up storage, it does lead to some strange scenarios, such as Bowser Jr. unveiling a power-up, Mario collecting the power-up, and then Bowser Jr. throwing it back at you when needed. Bowser Jr. ends up feeling like a natural progression of the second player mode in Super Mario Odyssey. Mario is still the central point of that game, with Bowser Jr. acting as a supporter role a la Cappy. He naturally has a larger presence in the game world compared to the Hat, and has a few unique interactions with objects in the game world that would only otherwise be accessible via the pointer. In single player, Bowser Jr. just never ends up feeling quite useful. That being said, if the game world was littered with objects only accessible via Jr., it would make him a nuisance in single player mode, given how tedious controlling him alone is. Selecting things for companions to target via a gyro pointer is simply not an intuitive way of controlling things. Bowser Jr. may end up feeling a little pointless in single player mode, but I would still prefer this over a game where I'm constantly having to stop and target things via a clunky pointer. In spite of this, I still think the developers could have included just a couple more things to interact with in the world. As it stands, it never feels like that perfect balance between Bowser Jr. being annoying and useless was never quite achieved, with the game leaning towards the useless side. Thankfully, if you want to give the illusion of Jr. being useful, you can up his interactivity in the options menu, but this ultimately just makes him take out more objects and enemies. After some 50 shines, you'll find yourself facing off against Bowser for likely the last time. Touch one of the Giga Bells and Mario will grow to massive proportions, allowing you to square off against Bowser fair and square. In line with the rest of the segments featuring Bowser, these giant battles are truly something to behold. While gigantic Bowsers have appeared in previous Mario games, such as Mario Sunshine, this is the first real time a battle has truly captured the scale and grandeur of the event, largely aided by the smaller levels and scenery you've previously conquered, littering the battlefield. After besting Bowser in hand-to-hand combat, largely via the catsuit, the second part of the final battle begins. Utilizing Plessy, Mario must knock back the Giga Bells at Bowser to defeat him once and for all. With how much the game has featured Plessy up to this point, it's no surprise to see him appearing at least somewhat during the final segments of the game. Although I complained about Plessy earlier, I find it a little easier to defend here, given this is 1. A more cinematic finish to the fight, 2. The second part of a larger battle, and 3. How much of a spotlight Nintendo has placed on him. And with Bowser defeated one last time, the game comes to an end. It's truly impressive how different, yet similar, both Super Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury can be. Gone are many of the core tenets of Super Mario 3D World, such as the camera, 4-player co-op, linear levels, and unfortunately the big band jazz. These are instead, in my opinion, replaced with inferior substitutes. Ultimately, Bowser's Fury really is an experiment, and I kinda feel bad for tearing into it as bad as I have. However, compared to the pure platforming mastery Nintendo demonstrated with 3D World, I do feel disappointed with the offerings here. That being said, I won't be surprised if, in the future, we see some aspects of Bowser's Fury expanded upon, and open-world Mario games merge even closer with the flagpole-based ones. Despite my various criticisms of Bowser's Fury, I still would recommend the average person to try the game, if at least to experience Bowser's Fury. Just once. The problem is that this game stands next to 35 years of Mario platforming, and it really isn't a meaningful improvement to the Mario formula, nor does it truly succeed in the attempt to merge both 3D gameplay styles. Given the choice between Bowser's Fury and other games in the open-ended 3D Mario series, I'd have a difficult time going back to Bowser's Fury for any reason other than to experience the novelty of Bowser's Onslaught. Aside from the game's sole highlight, its spectacle, it's hard to find much in Bowser's Fury that meaningfully improves upon previous installments. The mode is laden with a variety of issues, from camera and control problems, to performance, to level design. In the same way that cats are afraid of new changes to their comfortable surroundings, I find myself wary of the changes made here to the Mario formula.